The Harris family felt a rush of excitement as they stepped out of their car, gazing at their new home. The large two-story house on Willow Street was nestled in a quiet, welcoming neighborhood, just what Malcolm and Dana Harris had dreamed of for their daughter, Layla. The decision to move had been a careful one, motivated by a desire to give Layla, their vibrant 6-year-old, a chance to grow up in a safe, nurturing environment. After a long day of unpacking boxes and rearranging furniture, Malcolm, a construction foreman with a solid frame and gentle demeanor, sat on the front steps, soaking in the serenity of the evening. Dana, his wife and a social worker known for her empathy, joined him, sharing a contented smile. "Feels like home already," she murmured, squeezing Malcolm's hand. Inside, Layla was exploring every corner of her new room. Her favorite stuffed animals were arranged on her bed. A colorful canopy hung above her headboard, and fairy lights decorated her windows. She spun around, her braided hair bouncing with each twirl, her giggles filling the air. But as night settled in and the house grew still, something unusual happened. Malcolm and Dana were jolted awake by a piercing scream. Racing to Layla's room, they found her sitting up, her small frame shaking as she clutched her stuffed bunny close. Her wide eyes were fixed on a shadowy corner of the room. Dana wrapped her arms around Layla, feeling the little girl's heartbeat race against her own chest. "Honey, what happened? Did you have a bad dream?" Dana asked gently, brushing a loose strand from Layla's tear-streaked face. Layla shook her head vehemently. "No, Mommy, I wasn't dreaming. He was here, standing there in the corner, watching me." She pointed a trembling finger to the corner of the room. Malcolm exchanged a worried glance with Dana. He moved to the corner, inspecting it closely, even pulling aside the curtains to check if something outside could have caused a shadow. But everything appeared normal. "Sweetheart, sometimes when we're in a new place, our minds can play tricks on us. Maybe you imagined it," Malcolm said softly, though a prickle of unease lingered in his chest. But Layla shook her head again. "No, Daddy. He was real. I saw him, just like I see you and Mommy." Her certainty sent a chill down Malcolm's spine, but he managed a comforting smile. "All right, let's try to get some sleep. I'll stay with you tonight," he offered, easing Layla back under her covers. For the next few nights, things seemed calm. Layla settled into her room, growing more confident as she filled it with her favorite things and adjusted to the new surroundings. But on the 5th night, the peace shattered once more. This time, Malcolm woke to Layla standing beside their bed, her little hand shaking as she tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy," he was here again. I woke up, and he was right there, just staring at me, she whispered, her voice thick with tears. Malcolm sat up, rubbing his eyes, caught between exhaustion and concern. "All right, show me where you saw him, Layla." They walked back to her room, Dana following closely. Layla led them to her bed, pointing to the foot of it where she claimed the man had stood. Malcolm inspected every corner, finding nothing unusual. The next day, Malcolm and Dana discussed the situation, their minds troubled. Dana had taken note of Layla's insistence, but she couldn't overlook the stress a new move could cause on a child. They decided to try calming her with extra bedtime stories and reassuring words. For a while, it seemed to work, but just when they thought the matter was resolved, Layla's nightmares returned, stronger than ever. One evening, Malcolm decided to set up a small camera in Layla's room, hidden carefully so that it wouldn't worry her. He explained it as a night guardian, meant to keep her safe and watch over her as she slept. Layla seemed reassured, nodding with a brave little smile. That night, she finally drifted off without fear. However, the footage from that first night revealed nothing unusual. The next few nights were the same, and Malcolm began to wonder if they were simply dealing with childhood fears after all. But one stormy night, a faint shadowy figure appeared in the recording. It lingered in the corner for just a second before fading, leaving Malcolm wide awake, his heart pounding. He replayed the footage, questioning his own eyes, but the image remained. Shaken, he glanced at Dana, knowing they'd need more than comforting words to uncover the truth. After the unsettling discovery on the footage, Malcolm struggled to focus the next day. Every time he replayed the video in his mind, his stomach clenched with dread. The shadow had only lingered for a moment, but it was enough to set his instincts ablaze. This wasn't just a figment of Layla's imagination. Something, or someone, had been in her room. He wanted to show the recording to Dana immediately, but she had a long day at work ahead, meeting with clients and tackling case files, and he didn't want to alarm her needlessly. Instead, he waited until the evening, deciding to be cautious and ensure the house was as secure as possible. He checked the locks on every window and door, tested the alarm system, and even made sure that their back fence was fully intact. When Dana came home, Malcolm waited until Layla was asleep before pulling her aside to the kitchen and sharing the video with her. As the clip played on his phone, he watched Dana's face drain of color, her fingers clutching the counter for support. "Malcolm, what is this?" Her voice was barely a whisper, yet thick with shock. "I don't know," he replied, rubbing a hand across his face. "I've checked every corner of her room, all around the house. There's no logical explanation for it. But whatever it is, it's terrifying her. And it doesn't seem like it's going to stop." Dana was silent for a moment, gathering her thoughts, then turned to him with a new resolve in her eyes. "We need to figure this out, Malcolm. If someone, or something, is coming into our home, we can't just stand by. We have to protect Layla." Malcolm nodded, reassured by her determination. Together, they decided to keep the camera running and agreed that if there was even the slightest hint of another presence, they'd go to the police, no matter how strange it sounded. They would install another camera outside Layla's window too, hoping to capture any movement from the backyard. The next few nights passed quietly. They took turns staying up, anxiously watching the monitor. But each time the sun rose, the footage remained clear, with no disturbances. Layla slept better, unaware of her parents' vigilance, her fear gradually replaced by the comfort of their constant presence. But on the fourth night, their vigil was interrupted. Malcolm had just begun to nod off on the couch when a faint, rhythmic creaking sound filled the room. He sat up, pulse racing, as the sound grew louder, seeming to echo from Layla's room. Dana, asleep beside him, woke at his jolt, blinking in confusion. "Did you hear that?" Malcolm asked, his voice taut. Dana nodded, her eyes wide. Without another word, they crept toward Layla's room, moving silently down the hallway. The sound grew clearer with each step, and they quickly recognized it as the distinct creak of floorboards. Outside Layla's door, Malcolm's breath hitched. He placed a hand on the doorknob, exchanging a quick glance with Dana. His heart was pounding, but he couldn't hesitate. With a swift motion, he opened the door and flicked on the light. The room was still, quiet, save for Layla's steady breathing. She lay undisturbed under her blankets, her face soft and peaceful in sleep. Malcolm's eyes scanned every corner, noting nothing out of place. Dana entered, her gaze sweeping over the room, then paused. "Malcolm, the window," she murmured, pointing. The window, which had been closed and latched earlier, was now open by a few inches, cold air seeping into the room. Malcolm's jaw tightened as he approached the window. His hand found the lock, which was still intact. "This can't just open on its own," he said quietly. He glanced back at Dana, who was now visibly unnerved. Dana shivered, rubbing her arms as she joined him by the window. But who? How? She let the questions hang in the air, the answer too elusive and too frightening to put into words. They double-checked every lock in the house that night, even bracing the windows with sticks, trying to find solace in the steps they were taking. But the mystery loomed larger with each attempt to ignore it. As dawn finally broke, Malcolm and Dana exchanged a weary glance, knowing they couldn't simply ignore this. They needed help. The following day, Malcolm confided in his close friend, Simon, who worked as a security specialist. Simon was a straightforward, no-nonsense guy, known for his expertise and absolute professionalism. After hearing Malcolm's story, Simon's brows knitted in concern. "All right," he said finally. "I'll come by tonight. I'll bring a couple of motion sensors and set up extra cameras. If someone's creeping around your place, we'll catch them." That evening, Simon arrived with his equipment. Layla, already used to her parents' recent routine of checking her room, watched with curiosity as Simon installed small, discreet devices near the windows and the hallway leading to her room. They explained to her that the new safety gadgets were just extra security, like the camera in her room, and Layla seemed satisfied with that answer. Once Simon finished, he sat down with Malcolm and Donna, his expression grave. "Listen, I've seen cases where people find ways into homes that seem impossible, but I want you both to stay alert. If you hear anything out of the ordinary, call me. I'll be monitoring the cameras from home tonight, and if there's any motion, I'll get a ping right away." With this reassurance, Malcolm and Dana tried to relax, though a new layer of anxiety lingered between them. They were grateful for Simon's help, but knew that the reality of having to monitor their own home like a fortress was unsettling. As midnight approached, Dana lay awake, her hand entwined with Malcolm's. She squeezed his hand, feeling the tremor in his grip. "We'll get through this, Malcolm," she whispered, trying to reassure him and herself. But in the silence that followed, a chilling, metallic click echoed from Layla's room, followed by a faint but distinct rustling. Malcolm and Dana bolted upright, fear and adrenaline racing through their veins. Before they could even process what they'd heard, Malcolm's phone buzzed. Simon's name flashed on the screen. "Malcolm." Simon's voice was low, tense. "I just got a motion alert. There's someone in her room." Time seemed to stop as Malcolm and Dana charged down the hall, their feet barely touching the floor. Malcolm threw open the door, his heart hammering wildly, and flipped on the light. The room was empty, or so it seemed at first glance. Layla was awake, sitting upright, her wide eyes reflecting confusion and fright. Malcolm hurried to her side, wrapping his arms around her, searching for any sign of harm. But then he spotted something that froze his blood. In the center of the room, there was a footprint, large and unmistakable, pressed deep into the carpet, as if someone had been standing there just moments before. But there was no one in sight, and all the windows and doors were locked, secure. Malcolm backed away, pulling Layla with him, while Donna covered her mouth, her face ashen. They both knew this was no figment of imagination. Something, or someone, was entering their home without a trace, without leaving any explanation except for a few ominous signs. Simon arrived moments later, reviewing the footage he'd captured. Sure enough, a faint figure was caught on the camera entering Layla's room, stopping at the foot of her bed, and vanishing just as quickly. "I don't understand," Simon muttered, rubbing his temples. "This makes no sense. The motion sensors should have detected an entry, but they didn't. It's like this person just appeared out of nowhere." Malcolm clenched his fists, a mix of anger and terror bubbling within him. "I don't care if it makes sense or not. This is our daughter. She's not safe here, and we're not letting this continue." Dana nodded, her face pale but resolute. "We're calling the police. Tonight." The police arrived, and after taking down the details, an officer stepped aside to speak with Malcolm and Dana. "We'll investigate," he assured them. "But in the meantime, I suggest you consider moving her to your room until we can get to the bottom of this." The Harris family nodded, aware of the uncertainty that now loomed over their home. They had come to this quiet neighborhood for peace, for a fresh start. But as Malcolm held his daughter close that night, watching her drift off in their bed, he felt an iron resolve building within him. Whoever, or whatever, was behind this, they would find answers. For Layla's sake, they had no choice, and if this was only the beginning, they would be ready for whatever came next. The following morning, the house was silent, and tension lingered in every room. Malcolm and Dana had barely slept, their nerves frayed from the night's events. Layla, thankfully, seemed unaffected, her innocent chatter filling the breakfast table with a strange contrast to the fear Malcolm felt growing inside him. After the police officer's visit, Malcolm had replayed Simon's footage dozens of times. Each time, he watched the faint, distorted figure appear and disappear at the foot of Layla's bed, leaving only that strange footprint behind. The police were still conducting their investigation, but their quiet assurances had done little to alleviate the anxiety Malcolm and Dana felt. They were left waiting for answers, uncertain about what lurked within their own home. After breakfast, Dana suggested they take a walk to clear their minds. They ventured out into the brisk morning air, letting Layla run ahead on the tree-lined sidewalks. Malcolm's gaze drifted across the rows of houses, each one quaint and neatly kept, their tidy yards and flower beds radiating a false sense of safety. "It doesn't make sense," Dana whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know Layla's been seeing something, but I keep wondering how we didn't notice anything until now. We've been here for weeks." Malcolm nodded, chewing on the thought. Maybe it's something, or someone, who knows how to stay hidden. Or maybe they were just waiting for the right time to show themselves. Dana shuddered, hugging herself against the chill. "I don't even want to think about that. But we can't ignore it, Malcolm. If the police don't find anything, we'll need to consider leaving. I'd rather find another place than let our daughter live in fear." As they walked back, they noticed their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Kerr, sitting on her front porch, sipping tea. She was a reserved but kindly woman, always watching the neighborhood with a keen eye. Malcolm and Dana had waved to her a few times, but hadn't yet gotten to know her well. Today, however, Mrs. Kerr seemed unusually interested in them, her gaze fixed on Layla. "Good morning, Mrs. Kerr," Dana greeted politely, trying to mask her unease. The old woman gave a small nod, setting down her cup. "Mornin'," she replied, her voice gravelly but clear. She glanced toward Layla, who was playing nearby. Such a sweet girl, that one. Must be hard on her, moving to a new place. Dana forced a smile. "Yes, it's been a bit of an adjustment." Mrs. Kerr hesitated, her eyes darting between Malcolm and Dana before she continued. "I don't mean to pry, but I couldn't help but notice. Has she been sleeping all right?" Malcolm and Dana exchanged a look of surprise, caught off guard. Mrs. Kerr's gaze remained steady, a hint of sympathy in her eyes. "Well," Malcolm began cautiously, "we've had some strange things happening at night." Mrs. Kerr's expression darkened, and she nodded knowingly. "You're not the first to tell me that." The statement hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. Dana took a step closer. "What do you mean, Mrs. Kerr? Has something happened in this house before?" The old woman sighed, her gaze drifting to the house. "I've lived here all my life, watched families come and go. But that house—" She trailed off, her eyes narrowing. "There've been rumors, things that can't be explained. Some say it's the land. Others think it's something in the house itself, something that lingers." Malcolm swallowed, his throat dry. "What kind of things?" Mrs. Kerr hesitated, then leaned in closer, her voice a low murmur. "They say that sometimes people see things. Shadows in the corners, figures at night. Kids, especially. They're more sensitive to these things, you know." Dana's heart skipped a beat, and her hands went cold. "And has anyone ever found out what it is?" Mrs. Kerr shook her head slowly. "No one stayed long enough to try. Most folks move away once they realize. But there was one family, the Pattersons. They were here before you. Their little boy, he saw things, just like your Layla. Said there was a man watching him. Scared the poor boy half to death." Malcolm felt a chill settle in his bones. "What happened to him?" "They moved not long after," Mrs. Kerr said, her gaze softening. "It was tough on them. The father wouldn't speak of it, but I remember the mother. She looked haunted. Told me once that whatever it was, it wanted something. Said it would only leave once it got what it came for." With that, Mrs. Kerr stood, giving them a sad, apologetic look. I don't mean to scare you, but sometimes it's best to know what you're dealing with. I hope you find a way to make it right. Good luck to you both." Malcolm and Dana walked back to the house in silence, the weight of Mrs. Kerr's words pressing down on them. As soon as they stepped inside, Dana let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling. "Malcolm, we can't stay here. Whatever this is, it's not going to leave us alone." Malcolm nodded, but his jaw was set in a determined line. "I know, but I'm not ready to give up yet. Layla deserves to grow up without fear, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure she's safe here. We're not going to let this thing, whatever it is, chase us away." That night, they tucked Layla into bed, assuring her that they were nearby, just down the hall. They'd made the decision to take turns staying awake, keeping watch until morning. Malcolm was up first, sitting in the hallway, the soft glow from Layla's nightlight casting long shadows across the walls. Hours ticked by slowly. Malcolm fought against his own exhaustion, his body heavy and weary, but he refused to let his guard down. Around 3 in the morning, his head began to droop, sleep tugging insistently at him. Just as he began to nod off, a soft creak snapped him awake. He straightened, heart pounding, and strained his ears, listening. Silence hung thick in the air, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator down the hall. He glanced at Layla's door, noting the slight crack of light seeping through, then shook his head, dismissing it as his imagination. But then, another sound, a soft, almost inaudible whisper, floated from Layla's room. Malcolm froze, every nerve on high alert. He edged closer, pushing the door open carefully. Layla lay still, her small figure bundled under the covers, her face peaceful. Malcolm scanned the room, squinting into the corners, half expecting to see a shadow lurking. As he turned to leave, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Near the foot of Layla's bed, he saw it, a faint, almost transparent figure standing still, watching him. Malcolm's breath caught in his throat, but he stood his ground, locking eyes with the shadow. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a face, a flash of pale skin, hollow eyes, a thin, twisted smile. A surge of anger flared within him, overriding his fear. He took a step forward, his voice low but fierce. "I don't know who you are, or what you want, but you're not welcome here. Leave. Now." The figure seemed to hesitate, its shape flickering, then slowly fading until it dissolved into the shadows, leaving the room cold and silent once more. Malcolm staggered back, his heart pounding wildly, and quickly shut the door, his hand shaking as he turned the lock. He stumbled back into the hallway, barely able to catch his breath. Dana found him sitting on the couch when she woke later that morning, his face pale and drawn. He told her everything, the figure, the twisted smile, the unsettling sense of malevolence that had filled the room. "We have to call someone," Dana said firmly. "Someone who can help us understand what this is." They decided to reach out to a local historian, someone who could shed light on the strange happenings in their home. A friend referred them to Mrs. Gable, an elderly woman who had lived in the town for decades. The moment she heard about their house, Mrs. Gable's eyes darkened with recognition. "That place," she murmured, shaking her head. "That house has a history. It was built on the land where an old sanatorium once stood, a place that, well, let's just say it wasn't known for kindness." Malcolm's stomach churned. What does that have to do with what we're seeing? "Spirits can linger, especially when there's unfinished business," Mrs. Gable said solemnly. "If your daughter is seeing someone, it's likely they're drawn to her innocence. Children have a way of sensing things that adults cannot." Dana swallowed hard, clutching Malcolm's hand. "So, what can we do?" Mrs. Gable regarded them thoughtfully. "You need to acknowledge it. Make it known that you're not here to harm or disturb. Set boundaries, but also be prepared. Spirits don't always listen." With heavy hearts, Malcolm and Dana returned home, unsure of their next steps, but determined to protect Layla. That evening, as they tucked her into bed, Malcolm whispered a silent promise. Whatever happened, they would face it together. They would protect their daughter and ensure that their home was safe, even if it meant confronting the shadows within. The Harris household was filled with an anxious quiet. Malcolm and Dana could feel the weight of their decision to stay. But now, armed with the knowledge Mrs. Gable had shared, they were preparing to fight back. If this spirit, or whatever it was, thought it could intimidate them into leaving, it would soon learn otherwise. The next few nights were tense but uneventful. Malcolm and Dana took turns staying awake, keeping vigil by Layla's door. Every small sound sent their nerves on edge, but the figure didn't return. Layla slept peacefully, blissfully unaware of the dark presence that lurked around her. It almost felt like the figure had retreated after Malcolm's last encounter with it, and a cautious optimism began to grow within them. But on the fifth night, everything changed. Malcolm was on his watch shift, sitting quietly outside Layla's room, when he felt a prickling at the back of his neck, a cold, creeping sensation that made his skin crawl. He glanced around, half expecting to see a shadow, but the hallway was empty. The house was silent, save for the ticking of the old clock in the living room. Suddenly, he heard a faint sound from Layla's room, a soft creak, as if someone were shifting their weight on the floor. His heart pounded as he pressed his ear against the door, holding his breath. Then, from behind the door, he heard it clearly, a low, murmured voice. Faint but distinct. Layla. Malcolm's blood ran cold. He burst through the door, flicking on the light, his gaze scanning every inch of the room. But there was no one there. Layla was asleep, her chest rising and falling in steady breaths. Yet the air felt thick, oppressive, filled with an unseen presence that Malcolm could almost feel pressing against him. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice shaking with anger and fear. "What do you want from us?" The silence that followed was heavy, charged with a strange, palpable energy. Then, as he turned to leave, he caught sight of something on Layla's dresser, a message scrawled in the dust that hadn't been there before. It was a single word, etched in jagged letters. Stay. Malcolm's heart thundered in his chest as he stared at the word, his fists clenched. This wasn't just some residual spirit lingering in the house. This was an entity with purpose, a presence that could manipulate its surroundings and leave messages. The next morning, Malcolm and Dana sat at the kitchen table, the word "stay" haunting them both. They knew they couldn't face this alone. So they reached out to a local paranormal investigator, a woman named Amelia Reyes, who came highly recommended by Mrs. Gable. Amelia was experienced and had a reputation for being level-headed and unafraid of confronting hostile entities. When Amelia arrived that evening, her calm presence brought a sense of relief to the household. She was a petite woman with sharp, dark eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, carrying a small bag of equipment. She greeted Malcolm and Dana with a firm handshake and a warm smile before setting her equipment up in Layla's room. "I'll start by reading the energy in the room," she explained, her voice steady and clear. "It'll help me get a sense of what we're dealing with. If there's a spirit here, it should leave some sort of impression." As Amelia began her work, Dana and Malcolm watched from the doorway, their anxiety mounting. She moved around the room with a small device that emitted a faint beep, pausing every few feet as if sensing something unseen. Occasionally, she would close her eyes, standing still with a look of deep concentration. After a while, Amelia turned to them, her expression grim. "There's definitely something here. It's a strong presence, and it's unsettled. I don't believe this is a spirit that's passing through. It feels tied to this place, like it's protecting something." Malcolm's jaw tightened. Protecting what? What could it possibly want? Amelia took a slow breath. "It's difficult to say. Sometimes, these entities linger because of a deep-seated emotion, anger, regret, guilt, but I'll need to do more to understand it fully." She opened her bag, pulling out a bundle of sage and a small bowl. "If you're comfortable, I'd like to do a cleansing. It's a first step, and it might help calm the energy here." They agreed immediately, eager for any relief from the oppressive force that had invaded their lives. Amelia began the cleansing ritual, moving through the room with the sage, letting its smoke curl through the air as she chanted softly. She stopped at each corner of the room, murmuring prayers and invocations, her voice low and soothing. As she neared the window, the air seemed to grow colder, and the smoke swirled violently, as if caught in an unseen current. Dana felt a shiver run down her spine, watching the smoke twist and writhe, almost resisting Amelia's efforts. After what felt like an eternity, Amelia finished the cleansing, setting the sage aside. She turned to Malcolm and Donna, her face pale but resolute. "It's still here. I was able to disrupt it, but whatever's haunting this house, it's deeply rooted. This spirit doesn't want to leave." Layla, who had been watching the ritual with wide eyes, finally spoke. "Is the man going to go away now?" she asked, her voice small and trembling. Amelia knelt beside her, offering a reassuring smile. "We're working on it, sweetheart. But you need to be brave, okay? We'll make sure he doesn't bother you anymore." That night, Malcolm and Dana decided that Layla would sleep in their room until they resolved the haunting. It was a difficult decision. They didn't want her to live in fear, but they couldn't risk her being alone in that room, vulnerable to whatever might be lurking there. For the next 2 nights, things were calm. Layla slept soundly in her parents' bed, and Malcolm and Dana began to hope that perhaps the cleansing had weakened the spirit's grip. But on the 3rd night, as they were settling down to sleep, they heard it again, the creaking of floorboards, followed by a faint, rasping voice. This time, the voice was clearer, louder, echoing through the house. "Leave, now." Malcolm jumped out of bed, heart pounding as he flipped on a light, scanning the room for any sign of the intruder. The voice continued, its tone menacing, filling the air with a sense of dread that wrapped around them like a suffocating fog. They moved swiftly, gathering Layla and rushing downstairs. Dana was on the verge of tears, clutching Layla tightly, while Malcolm held his phone, ready to dial Amelia's number. But before he could call, the voice spoke again, this time in a whisper that seemed to drift from every corner of the house. "Stay, stay, or she will pay." The voice was unmistakable, clear, and filled with a dark intent that chilled them to the bone. Malcolm, unable to contain his rage, shouted into the darkness, "What do you want? Why are you doing this to us?" The only response was a low, mocking laugh that echoed down the empty hallway. The following morning, Amelia returned with another investigator, an older man named Henry who specialized in identifying hostile entities. He was calm, methodical, and after listening to their experiences, he nodded gravely. "I believe you're dealing with what we call a shadow entity. They're rare, but when they latch onto a place or a family, they're very difficult to get rid of." "What does it want with us?" Dana asked, her voice trembling. Henry looked down, his brow furrowed. "Unfortunately, these entities often feed off fear, especially from children. Your daughter's sensitivity may have attracted it, but it's hard to say for certain. We'll need to conduct a full ritual, one that can sever its connection to this house." They prepared for the ritual that night, setting up candles and protective charms around the house. Amelia and Henry led the Harris family through a series of prayers, calling on their resolve and courage. Layla, clutching her mother's hand, watched in quiet awe, her eyes wide with trust. As they began the ritual, the house seemed to come alive with energy. Shadows shifted and flickered along the walls, as if resisting the ritual's power. The air grew thick, charged with a strange, electric tension. Then suddenly, a loud crash echoed from Layla's room, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. "Hold the line," Henry instructed firmly, his voice steady. "Do not break the circle." The shadows grew darker, thicker, coiling around them like tendrils of smoke. Layla clung to her mother, fear etched across her face, but Dana whispered reassurances, holding her tightly. After what felt like an eternity, Amelia's voice grew louder, stronger, as she finished the ritual. In the name of all that is good, you are banished from this place. You have no power here. Be gone. A sudden, piercing wail filled the room, a sound so filled with rage and despair that it made their skin crawl. The air seemed to pulse, and then, with a final shriek, the shadows recoiled, fading into nothingness. Silence settled over the house, thick and heavy. Malcolm and Dana exchanged a look, their faces pale but filled with relief. Amelia nodded, her face lined with exhaustion, but also triumph. "It's gone," she said softly. "You're safe now." For the first time in weeks, Malcolm felt a sense of peace wash over him. They had faced the darkness head-on, driven it away with courage and resilience. And as he looked down at Layla, her small face now relaxed and peaceful, he knew they had finally reclaimed their home. The days that followed the exorcism were calm, almost unnervingly so. Malcolm and Dana reveled in the peace that had finally settled over their home, their hearts lighter than they had felt in weeks. Layla had returned to her normal self, her bubbly energy filling the house once more, and Malcolm and Dana found solace in the absence of shadows, eerie sounds, and strange happenings. But just as they were beginning to let their guard down, a series of small disturbances made them question if the entity had truly gone. It began subtly. Layla would occasionally glance over her shoulder while playing in her room, a small frown creasing her brow, as if she felt someone watching her. At first, Malcolm and Dana brushed it off as lingering anxiety. But when Layla started complaining about her toys going missing, only to reappear in strange places around the house, they began to wonder if they had overlooked something. One evening, Dana was tidying up Layla's room when she felt an odd draft. The window was closed and locked, so she assumed it was coming from the door. But as she moved past the far wall, she noticed that the draft grew stronger, as if it were seeping from the wall itself. Curious, Dana ran her hand along the wall, feeling for any cracks or openings. She found none, but the chill remained, a steady, eerie sensation that raised goosebumps on her skin. When Malcolm got home, she shared her discovery with him. He laughed it off at first, joking that maybe it was just bad insulation. But Dana's unease was contagious, and soon he found himself staring at the wall, feeling the same inexplicable cold. They agreed to investigate further, hoping that the source of the draft would offer some rational explanation. The next morning, Malcolm borrowed a stud finder and a flashlight from his toolbox. He tapped the walls, pressing his ear against them to listen for any hollow sounds, working his way across every inch. When he reached Layla's closet, he stopped. The air was colder there, more so than anywhere else in the room. The stud finder beeped erratically as he moved it over the wall, as if it were struggling to read whatever lay beyond. "Dana," he called, keeping his voice calm to avoid alarming Layla, who was drawing in the living room. "I think I found something." Dana joined him, her face tense. "What do you think it is?" "I'm not sure," he replied, grabbing a crowbar. "But I think there's a hollow space behind this wall." He worked carefully, prying away a section of the wall. The drywall gave way easily, revealing a small, dark cavity. Malcolm shone the flashlight inside, peering into the hidden space. His breath caught as the beam illuminated a narrow, dusty crawl space, just big enough for a person to squeeze through. A shiver ran down his spine as he realized that this hidden area extended back toward the house's foundation. Dana gasped, covering her mouth. "Oh my God, Malcolm, do you think someone was in here?" Malcolm nodded, feeling a sickening sense of dread settle over him. "It's possible. And if someone was using this space, it would explain everything. The shadows, the strange noises, even the footprint. But who would do this?" Dana's voice trembled with disbelief. "And why?" Malcolm inspected the crawl space further, moving the flashlight across the dusty floor. That's when he spotted something lying in the corner. An old notebook, yellowed with age, its cover smeared with dirt. He reached in and grabbed it, brushing off the dust as he handed it to Dana. She opened the notebook cautiously, flipping through its brittle pages. Each page was filled with scrawled handwriting, barely legible, but clearly desperate, frantic. Some passages were written over others, the ink overlapping in dark, twisted spirals. As Donna began to read, a chill settled over the room. "I watch them," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I watch them. And they don't know I'm here. They never know. I'm always here, in the shadows, waiting for the right time. Watching, watching." Malcolm felt his stomach churn as Donna read the words aloud. The writing grew more erratic, sentences fragmenting into phrases and broken thoughts. But the message was clear. Whoever had written this had been watching the previous occupants of the house, lurking in the hidden space, observing their every move. Dana turned the page, and a photograph slipped out, fluttering to the floor. Malcolm bent down to pick it up, his hand shaking as he held it up to the light. It was an old black-and-white photograph of a family, a mother, father, and 2 children, posing outside a house that looked eerily similar to theirs. That's our house," Donna murmured, her face pale. Malcolm nodded, turning the photograph over. Scrawled on the back in the same erratic handwriting were the words, "They belong to me." A sick realization washed over them both. This wasn't just a spirit, Donna whispered, her voice thick with horror. A person was living in this space, watching the families that lived here. Malcolm swallowed, his mind racing. But who? And why would they still be here, haunting us? They pored over the notebook together, piecing together fragments of entries. Each passage revealed more about the writer's twisted mind. An obsession with watching, a fixation on invading people's lives without them ever knowing. Whoever this person had been, they'd long since crossed the line between reality and madness. One entry caught Dana's attention, sending a chill down her spine. "I won't leave. I can't leave. This house is mine, and everyone who enters will know that it's mine. I am the shadow. I am always here." Malcolm clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists. Whoever this person was, they left a piece of themselves behind. It's like their obsession became a part of this house. Their discovery left them shaken. They called Amelia, the paranormal investigator, to share what they'd found. When she arrived, her face darkened as she examined the notebook. "This explains everything," she said quietly. "The spirit wasn't random. It's an imprint left behind by someone's will. Obsessed spirits are among the hardest to banish because their attachment isn't just to a place. It's to a way of being. This person wanted to stay here, to haunt this space forever. And that energy is embedded in the walls." "Is there anything more we can do?" Dana asked, desperation thick in her voice. Amelia thought for a moment, then nodded. "There's one more step we can try. It's a ritual that goes beyond cleansing. It severs the connection entirely. But it's difficult. We'll need to confront the spirit directly and command it to leave. It may not go easily." They agreed, knowing they had no other choice. Amelia prepared for the ritual, marking the room with protective symbols, scattering salt along the floor, and placing candles around the walls. She instructed Malcolm and Dana to repeat a chant with her, their voices weaving together as they called upon the spirit to depart. The air grew heavy, thick with an oppressive energy that made it difficult to breathe. Shadows gathered in the corners of the room, swirling and twisting, and then a faint whisper echoed through the walls. "I am here." The voice was low, guttural, filled with malice. Dana clutched Malcolm's hand, her grip tight. "Please," she whispered, "just leave us alone." The shadow seemed to shift, taking on a vague, humanoid form. It lingered near the corner of the room, watching them with hollow, unseen eyes. Amelia's voice grew louder, her words powerful, commanding. "You do not belong here. Your time in this house is over. Go to your rest and trouble this place no longer." For a moment, the figure hesitated, as if weighing her words. Then it moved closer, its form growing darker, more defined. "They belong to me. it hissed, its voice echoing with a deep, sinister rage. Malcolm stepped forward, his voice steady despite the fear in his heart. "This is our home now. You have no power here." With those words, Amelia threw a handful of salt toward the shadow, and it recoiled, twisting and writhing as if in agony. The candles flickered, their flames dancing wildly, casting strange, distorted shapes on the walls. The shadow's form grew weaker, its edges fraying, dissolving into wisps of darkness. Finally, with a low guttural wail, it vanished, leaving the room in silence. As the final echoes faded, Malcolm and Dana looked at each other, their faces filled with relief and exhaustion. The oppressive energy had lifted, leaving the room light, almost peaceful. Amelia nodded, satisfied. "It's over. The connection has been broken." The Harris family felt a weight lift from their shoulders. They thanked Amelia, grateful for her help, and for the first time in weeks, they felt truly safe in their own home. That night, as they tucked Layla into bed, Malcolm whispered softly, "It's over, sweetheart. You're safe now." Layla looked up at him, her eyes bright and trusting. No more shadows. Malcolm smiled, his heart swelling with relief. No more shadows. And as they watched their daughter drift off to sleep, Malcolm and Dana felt a profound sense of peace, knowing they had finally reclaimed their home from the darkness that had haunted them. The shadows were gone, banished by their courage and determination to protect their family. And as dawn broke over their quiet neighborhood, they knew they had overcome something powerful, reclaiming their lives and their future once and for all. The days following the ritual brought a new warmth into the Harris home, one that seemed to fill every corner with light. For the first time since moving in, Malcolm and Dana truly felt at ease. Layla was back to her old self, her laughter echoing through the halls, her toys scattered around the house as she played with the unburdened joy of a child. Peace had settled, yet an invisible scar lingered, a memory of the dark presence that once haunted their lives. To bring finality to their experience, Malcolm and Dana agreed to renovate Layla's room, wanting to create a fresh, positive space that would symbolize their new beginning. With the hidden crawl space sealed off and the wall repainted, the room took on a lighter tone, adorned with cheerful colors that Layla had picked herself. As they painted, cleaned, and redecorated, it felt as though they were physically and emotionally cleansing their home of any lingering energy that might have remained. One afternoon, as Malcolm was packing up some old things in the attic, he stumbled upon a dusty cardboard box shoved into a dark corner. He knelt down and pulled it out, brushing away layers of dust, revealing the faded label, Patterson Family. Recognizing the name from Mrs. Kerr's stories, Malcolm felt a surge of curiosity. He opened the box carefully, finding it filled with photos, letters, and a few old keepsakes. He took the box downstairs, where Donna was busy arranging Layla's new bookshelf. "I found something in the attic," he said, showing her the box. It belonged to the Pattersons, the family Mrs. Kerr mentioned, the ones who lived here before us. Dana wiped her hands and sat down beside him, pulling the box closer. "Maybe there's something here that can give us some answers," she murmured. Together, they began to sift through the items. The photos were faded, but it was clear that the family had once been happy. There were pictures of two young children playing in the front yard, a family vacation, a birthday party. Images that looked hauntingly similar to their own family moments. But as they looked closer, Malcolm noticed a difference. In the background of some photos, faint shadows seemed to linger, almost as if a figure were watching from a distance. Then they found a journal, the cover worn, and the pages yellowed with age. Dana carefully opened it, revealing the handwriting of a young woman named Lydia Patterson. Her entries began cheerfully, speaking of the joys of family life. But over time, her words grew dark and anxious. She wrote of strange noises at night, glimpses of shadows in the corners of her children's room, and a sense of being watched that grew stronger with each passing day. One entry, dated only days before the Pattersons left, struck Donna with a chill. "He won't let us go. He hides in the shadows, watching, waiting. My children wake up screaming, but no one believes me. We're prisoners in our own home. This house is his, he says. He says we belong to him. I have to protect my babies. We'll leave, but I don't know if it will be enough. I don't know if he'll let us go. The last line trailed off, the ink smeared as though written in haste. Malcolm and Dana exchanged a look, a mixture of sadness and understanding passing between them. I can't imagine what she went through, Dana whispered, to feel so helpless. It's like this spirit, this person, was feeding off her fear, trapping her here just like he tried to do with us. Malcolm nodded, feeling the deep empathy for the family that had come before them. But it's over now. Whatever happened to them, we broke the connection. We put an end to it. They spent the rest of the afternoon going through the box, hoping to find something that would shed light on the man in the shadows. But there was nothing. Whoever he had been, his story was lost to time, leaving only the remnants of his obsession in that notebook and the energy he had left behind. Once they'd finished, Dana suggested they take the box to Mrs. Kerr. The old woman had known the Pattersons, and perhaps it would bring her some closure to know that their story had not been forgotten. When they arrived at her home, Mrs. Kerr welcomed them with a weary smile, her sharp eyes softening as she took the box in her hands. I always wondered what happened to Lydia and her family, Mrs. Kerr murmured, her gaze distant. They left in such a hurry. The poor woman, she was so afraid. I tried to help, but she trailed off, shaking her head. Dana placed a comforting hand on Mrs. Kerr's shoulder. Thank you for everything, Mrs. Kerr. Your support helped us get through this. The older woman nodded, a small, sad smile touching her lips. It's good that you're staying, that you're making it a home again. This place has been waiting for a family strong enough to banish the darkness, and I think you've done just that. They thanked Mrs. Kerr and returned home, feeling lighter than they had in weeks. Malcolm and Dana shared a quiet dinner, savoring the newfound peace that had settled in their home. As they ate, they talked about the future, about making new memories in a place that had once felt like a prison. They were no longer haunted, but instead empowered, their bond as a family stronger than ever. Later that night, Malcolm tucked Layla into bed, sitting beside her for a few extra moments as she drifted off to sleep. As he watched her, he felt a swell of gratitude and relief. They had faced something truly dark, something that had tested their courage, but they had overcome it together. Dana joined him in the doorway, her face softened by a gentle smile. You know, for a while, I thought we'd made a mistake coming here, she whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder. But now, I feel like this is exactly where we're supposed to be. Malcolm nodded, wrapping an arm around her. This is our home, he replied quietly, and nothing is going to take that from us. They left Layla's room, closing the door gently behind them. As they walked back to their own room, Malcolm felt a lingering warmth, a sense of completion, as though they had truly reclaimed every corner of their house. He no longer felt the cold, prickling sensation that had haunted him in those first weeks, no longer glanced over his shoulder expecting to see a shadow in the corner. In bed, they lay together, hands entwined, their breathing synchronized as they drifted into a deep, untroubled sleep. The house was silent, peaceful, wrapped in the quiet hum of nightfall. But as dawn broke and light began to seep through the windows, something subtle shifted in the air, a feeling of relief, as if the house itself was exhaling, freed from the weight of a long-held burden. And with the new day, the Harris family woke to a world untouched by shadows, their spirits lifted, and their hearts filled with hope for the future. They had overcome the darkness that once claimed their home, and now it was truly theirs, filled with love, laughter, and the promise of brighter days ahead.